They say every small town has its ghost stories, tales to keep the kids in line. Ours was the Blackwood Manor. Growing up in Maple Hill, Pennsylvania, I'd heard all the rumors, the whispers about that decaying mansion at the end of Maple Street. People said that everyone in the Blackwood family had met a gruesome end, that murder and madness had sunk deep into the old house's bones. But, of course, that only made it more appealing to people like us, kids who craved a good scare. One hot July night, 3 of us, my best friends, Ryan and Nate and me, found ourselves daring each other to spend a night in the manor. It was just a stupid bet, driven by boredom and that naive sense of invincibility you have as a teenager. I should have known better. But God, I was young and foolish. I thought I could handle anything. When we reached the house, it was nearly sunset. The air was thick, almost suffocating. Giant oaks loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching over the cracked roof, like fingers ready to pluck us from the ground. A chill washed over me as I stared up at the towering structure. The manor was a hulking shadow, its windows broken and its porch rotting, as if the house itself wanted to swallow us whole. "Scared yet?" Nate whispered, his smirk barely visible in the fading light. I shrugged, feigning confidence. "Let's go before we lose daylight," I muttered, trying to ignore the dread building in my stomach. Inside the place was a tomb. Dust lay thick on every surface, the air was stale, and the faint scent of rot hung heavy. The hallways stretched on and on, vanishing into darkness. Our footsteps echoed, unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. The place was wrong. You could feel it, like a presence watching us. But none of us wanted to be the first to admit it. After wandering for what felt like hours, we settled in a room on the 2nd floor. Ryan had brought a couple of flashlights, and we sat in a circle, trying to keep our nerves in check. But every so often something would creak, and we'd freeze, our eyes darting around the room. Then, just as I started to relax, I heard it, faint, like a whisper carried on a breeze. Someone, or something, was talking. I strained to listen, but the sound vanished. Ryan must have seen my face because he laughed, though it sounded forced. "Don't go all pale on us," he said, elbowing me. "It's just an old house." But I knew what I'd heard. Ignoring the knot in my gut, I forced a smile, brushing it off as nerves. We were here to prove the legends wrong, after all. The hours dragged on. The manor seemed to settle into a deeper silence, as if waiting. Suddenly, the lights flickered, then went out. "Great," Nate groaned, fumbling in the darkness for his flashlight. I turned mine on and swept it around the room, trying to reassure myself. But when the beam landed on the doorway, my stomach dropped. There, in the shadows, was the outline of a figure. My breath caught. I blinked, and it was gone. Did you see that?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan and Nate turned, their flashlights sweeping the doorway, but there was nothing, just the empty hall, shrouded in darkness. "Stop messing with us, man," Ryan said, his voice shaky. But I wasn't messing with them. My heart was hammering, and the longer I looked into the darkness, the more I felt something watching. I didn't have long to dwell on it, though, because a sudden noise shattered the silence, a shriek, piercing and inhuman, echoing down the halls. Panic hit us like a wave. We bolted from the room, stumbling over each other as we raced down the stairs. The air was heavy, almost like it was pressing in on us, squeezing the breath from our lungs. The hallways seemed to stretch and twist, turning into a maze of endless doors and shadows. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath, stumbling forward, desperate to escape. I'd barely made it down the stairs when I realized something horrifying. I was alone. Ryan and Nate were nowhere in sight. The silence that followed was deafening, a dark, oppressive void that made my skin crawl. I couldn't hear their footsteps, their voices, nothing. "Ryan? Nate?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer, only the stillness, thick and suffocating. I stumbled through the halls, the floorboards creaking beneath me. Shadows seemed to move in the corner of my vision, flickering and shifting like they were alive. My head was pounding, and the silence was pressing in, suffocating me. I felt a sudden chill and froze. A sense of dread washed over me, a feeling I couldn't shake. Then, a hand, a cold, skeletal hand, clamped down on my shoulder. My heart stopped. I whipped around, but there was no one there, only darkness. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, when a whisper floated through the air, icy and hollow. "Get out!" I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and ran, my flashlight barely illuminating the path as I stumbled down the hall, desperate to find the exit. My footsteps echoed, the walls seeming to close in on me. Then, finally, I saw it. The front door, just a few feet away. I lunged for it, my hands fumbling with the handle as I threw it open and stumbled outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I collapsed onto the porch, gasping for breath. Behind me, the manor loomed, silent and dark, its windows like hollow eyes staring back at me. I waited on the porch, my heart pounding, hoping Ryan and Nate would emerge from the shadows. Minutes passed, then an hour, but they never came out. No one believed me when I finally told the story. They said the guys must have ditched me, that it was all a prank. But I know the truth. The Blackwood Manor took them, swallowed them whole, just like it wanted to do to me. I never went back to that house, and to this day, I don't set foot near Maple Street, because I know it's waiting, and one day, it'll find me again. The first time I heard about Hollow Creek, it sounded like paradise, a quiet coastal town where the sunset washed the skies in colors that looked almost unnatural. I arrived with plans to escape my hectic life in the city, to unwind by the shore. Little did I know the town would pull me into one of the most unsettling mysteries I'd ever encounter. It all began one humid evening. I was having a drink at the seaside tavern when I overheard a couple of locals whispering something about a girl named Emily Carter who'd gone missing years ago. I leaned in closer, unable to help myself. They spoke in hushed, uneasy tones, casting quick glances at the shadows, as though Emily's ghost might slip out at any moment. Emily was a well-known face around town, apparently. Beautiful, full of life, the kind of person people notice. She'd vanished one summer evening, leaving behind only her footsteps in the sand, faintly washed away by the rising tide. The locals scoured every inch of the beach, every alley and back street, but she had seemingly vanished into thin air. The eerie part. Some people claimed to see her, wandering near the cliffs, glowing faintly in the moonlight, calling out softly for help. If you listen real close at night, you might hear her, one of the men said, eyes wide, as though speaking her name would summon her right there in the bar. The story rattled in my mind for days, lingering like a cold shadow at my back. One night, I decided I had to see the cliffs myself. I left my room at the inn, just as the last trace of sunlight faded, casting Hollow Creek in dark shades of purple and gray. It was colder than I'd expected, a damp chill seeping through my jacket as I trekked the winding path toward the beach. The wind had picked up, carrying with it whispers and faint echoes, or so I thought. I shook my head, but the tingling at the back of my neck was real. Reaching the edge of the cliffs, I stared out over the ocean. Waves crashed against the rocks below, an endless churning darkness stretching beyond the edge of the world. Just as I turned to leave, something in the distance caught my eye. A figure, standing barely visible in the shadows near the water's edge. My heart began to hammer. Against my better judgment, I moved closer, picking my way down a narrow path carved into the cliffside. The figure stood perfectly still, watching the waves, her outline blurred and ghostly in the dim light. Emily? The name left my lips before I even realized I'd said it. Her head turned slowly, and I caught the faint gleam of eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. They were wide, unblinking, filled with something I could only describe as desperation. My throat tightened, my mind scrambled for something to say, but fear froze the words in my mouth. Then, without warning, she turned and walked straight into the waves. I rushed to the edge of the water, calling out as the surf swallowed her. But she had disappeared. The icy waves lapped at my feet, leaving me alone with only the sound of my own heavy breathing and the crash of the ocean. That night, I barely slept. Her image haunted me. Those eyes, that desperation. The next day I found myself at the library, desperate to uncover anything I could about Emily's disappearance. The librarians weren't keen to talk, but after enough pressing, one of them slipped me a file with faded newspaper clippings. One article mentioned a secluded spot known as Siren's Cove, a place where sailors had reportedly heard strange voices calling them, luring them toward jagged rocks and certain death. Some said it was cursed, haunted by souls lost at sea. And Emily's last sighting? It was right near the cove. Determined, I returned that night. The sea was restless, churning violently under a thick blanket of clouds. I felt a strange pull, something urging me to step closer to the edge, where waves foamed against the cliffs. And then, above the roar of the ocean, I heard it. A voice, faint, whispering my name. A shiver ran through me, and I stumbled back, nearly losing my footing. I forced myself to look around, but there was no one. The town, the cliffs, the sea. It was empty, silent except for that voice, calling again, louder, more desperate. I turned to run, heart pounding, but I could still hear her, her pleas echoing in my mind, almost inside my head. Back in my room, I locked the door, but the voice didn't stop. Every night since, she's there, just outside my window, whispering my name, pleading with me to help her. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see her face, hear that voice. It's like she's waiting for me, wanting me to follow her into that dark water. I can't shake the memory of that night, no matter how hard I try. It started as just another cold autumn evening, the kind where mist rolls through the hills, blanketing everything in a thick, eerie silence. I had been on my way to my new job in Boone County, having taken a wrong turn somewhere in the winding Appalachian backroads. My GPS, unreliable at best, had rerouted me onto a road I'd never heard of, Old Mill Road. I remember laughing to myself, wondering how locals in these small towns could handle such narrow, overgrown roads without losing their nerve. It was barely wide enough for a single car, and the trees along the roadside bent and twisted as though they were reaching for something, their branches forming an almost impenetrable canopy overhead. But of course, I'd been in plenty of dark woods before. I didn't buy into all the nonsense of local ghost stories, or at least, that's what I thought then. As I drove deeper down that road, my car's headlights struggled to cut through a fog that grew thicker by the second, almost as if it was alive, creeping in to wrap itself around my car. The air inside felt stifling, suffocating. I turned the heater off and cracked my window to get some fresh air, but the night air was dead still, thick and cold. That's when I saw her. A figure emerged from the swirling mist, standing on the side of the road, her form barely visible in the faint glow of my headlights. At first I thought it was a trick of the fog, but as I got closer, I saw her clearly. A woman in a long white dress, her hair spilling over her face, obscuring her features. Every instinct told me to keep driving, but something about her held me there, as though she was reaching into the depths of my mind, stirring up an overwhelming sorrow I couldn't explain. Against my better judgment, I slowed the car. "Do you need a lift?" I called out, my voice shaky, almost foreign. She turned slowly, her hair parting just enough for me to see her face. And when I saw her face, it's burned into my mind like a brand. Her eyes were hollow, dark pits, and her mouth hung open, frozen in a silent scream. I could feel her sorrow, a deep, haunting despair, like she had witnessed something no living soul was meant to see. A chill ran down my spine, and every hair on my body stood on end. I slammed my foot on the gas, desperate to escape, my heart pounding in my chest as the car sped down the narrow, winding road. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but she was gone. The fog was lifting slightly, and for a brief moment, I convinced myself it had all been some strange hallucination, a trick of the mind caused by fatigue and fear. But as I rounded the next bend, I saw her again. She was standing dead center in the road, her gaze fixed on me, her mouth contorted in that same soundless scream. I had no choice but to swerve, barely avoiding her as the car skidded off the road. My tires hit the loose dirt on the shoulder, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was going to crash. But I regained control, straightened the wheel, and pressed on, refusing to look back. I kept telling myself she was just a figment of my imagination, an illusion brought on by the oppressive fog. Yet every time I blinked, I saw her face again. That terror-stricken expression seared into my mind. I must have driven for what felt like hours, though in reality it was only minutes before I found myself back on the main road, where the fog dissipated, leaving nothing but the clear, cold night sky. I kept driving until I reached the first motel I could find, and there I stayed until morning, unable to sleep, every creak and shadow in the room making my pulse race. The locals must have seen the look in my eyes when I asked about the road the next day, because they exchanged glances before one of them spoke. "You saw her, didn't you?" An old man asked, his voice barely a whisper. He told me about the legend of the ghostly hitchhiker, the young woman who'd been murdered decades ago on Old Mill Road, her spirit forever trapped, searching for a way out, a ride that would never come. I haven't been able to drive down an isolated road since that night. Her face haunts me in every shadow, every dark corner, and when I close my eyes, I can still see her, her hollow eyes, her silent scream, and that overwhelming, soul-crushing sorrow. Whispering Pines, they call it, a town forgotten by time, where stories come to life and nightmares become real. And the ghostly hitchhiker of Old Mill Road, she's still out there, waiting for her next ride.